George F. Will is one of the top columnists in America. He writes for the Washington Post. And he called the guy I'm going to talk about today the first national superstar. 100 years after this man's birth, Hofstra University in New York held a conference about him, and I was at that conference. And they said he's still a major influence on things intellectual, educational, and cultural. In 2012, a jersey that he wore sold at auction for $4.4 million, a Guinness World Record. And as recently as 2017, the Smithsonian held an exhibit of photos and artwork about him and his life. They do this sort of thing for people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and they did one on him. And the curator at the Smithsonian said, he's the most famous American name in the world. I'm talking about Babe Ruth. Now, his impact and legacy go far beyond baseball and sport. It involves history, culture, the arts, and most definitely business, branding, and marketing. In fact, Babe Ruth was a marketing machine who set the mold. Any organization today that wants to build a name for itself, sell a product, or deliver a service can learn a lot from Babe Ruth. He smothered America with his presence at a time when there were no computers, no internet, no social media, no iPhones. There wasn't even TV. But he made himself a legend, and there was a lot more to it than myth. So I'm going to talk to you about Babe Ruth and his enormous impact on many fronts, and how he made history. And he certainly did make history, not just on the baseball field. Now, sure, he hit all those home runs from inside the box, the batter's box, but believe me, this guy was also thinking outside the box. I'm talking about the way he used words, his sense of humor and timing, his sense of purpose and place, the way he reached out to the masses, and even the way he reached out to targeted groups. This guy may have invented market segmentation. Now, Babe Ruth was quite an icon. And I want to talk to you about his impact, like I mentioned, on many different ways. He created a brand that has stood the test of time and continues to generate recognition today, which is why companies like Citibank, Nike, Adidas, Mercedes, and countless others use him to sell products. So what exactly is a brand? Well, I found this definition, and I want to read it to you. A brand is a combination of attributes communicated through a name or symbol that influences the mind of an audience and creates value. The value of a brand resides in the promise that the product or service will deliver. So, Gene Krupa was the Babe Ruth of drummers. Warren Buffett is the Babe Ruth of investors. And just over a week ago, Tom Brady was the Babe Ruth of football. Now, I don't know anybody else whose name is used like this. Babe Ruth, the name Babe Ruth means excellence, it means the best. But why? Well, think business value proposition. In business, we all, as consumers at least, in business we want safety, security, and sustainability. Well, Babe Ruth is all that, but more than anything we want trust, and he hit that one right out of the park. He knew who he was. He knew he wasn't just a baseball player. He knew he was more than that. He knew that he was a performer. In addition, he knew the product. He knew that baseball wasn't just a national pastime. It was part of the very fabric of America. This was a time when there weren't the other team sports competing with baseball like today. Baseball was pretty well lit, so he knew the product. And he certainly knew about marketing, a lot more about marketing than the big shots in the commissioner's office of Major League Baseball during his time. I say that because in those days, there were only 16 teams in Major League Baseball, 8 in the American League and 8 in the National League. And the furthest west was St. Louis. So after the season was over, Babe Ruth went on his famous barnstorming tours, which you may have heard about, where he took other Major League players, but he was the big draw, and they visited cities and towns that didn't have big league teams of their own. And they went as far as California. So they were spreading the brand, spreading the product, winning over new converts. What did baseball do? They fined him and they suspended him for barnstorming. Roger Angell is probably the most famous baseball writer in the world, and he's still around. He's 98 years old. And he called Babe Ruth the model for modern celebrity, and he was. In the 1920s, you had a new way of stardom that was emerging that combined personality with marketing and technology. And what was the technology? Well, you had moving pictures, and you had that transmission of the human voice, right? This is a new technology at that time. So what was the result of that? Babe Ruth was absolutely everywhere. The most famous person in America, if not the entire world. Personality, marketing, and technology, and that applies to today as well. And he was a master at that. Now, I also want to mention that Babe Ruth knew that history doesn't sell, but nostalgia does. And he knew this even after he retired because he was still in the public eye. And he also knew that first you sell the celebrity, and then you sell the product. So the guy was a master marketer. So back to an earlier question I asked, I said, how did he do it? Well, he did it with words. Never let the fear of striking out get in the way. Never let the fear of striking out get in the way. Well, think about that. It's a baseball analogy, but it goes far beyond baseball. And I'm sure many of you probably have heard of that. There's a website, BabeRuthCentral.com, which sells t-shirts with Babe Ruth sayings emblazoned across the chest. And they've got that one. And they have one like this. Every strike brings me closer to the next home run. Every strike brings me closer to the next home run. Now, is that inspirational or what? In 2014, the longtime pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Titusville, Pennsylvania, this is a church with a huge congregation. He was about to retire after a career of 42 years on the pulpit. 42 years. So what subject did he choose for his sermon that day? He wanted to talk about failure, and he chose Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth and a talk about failure. Okay, the sermon began like this. With the coming of spring, our thoughts turn to the great American sport of baseball. Those of us of a certain vintage invariably think of Babe Ruth as the great Sultan of SWAT. But did you know that Babe Ruth struck out 1,330 times? And I find that significant. You and I also fail. Indeed, Babe Ruth hit 714 home runs, but he struck out 1,330 times. By the way, that's still a pretty good ratio. But the point I want to make is this man inspired the masses, and he still does. Now, he came from nothing, and he made something of himself. And in that journey, he taught a lot of valuable lessons. He had little education, I think grade 8, in school, and also in the greater realm of life. And yet, he's quoted and revered by world leaders, religious scholars, academics, and leading thinkers to this very day. He was a source of inspiration and hope. Now, he had a great sense of humor. When it was pointed out that he made more money than the president, he said, I had a better year. I wonder what he would say today. Now, he had many faults. He was born dirt poor, came from the wrong side of the tracks in Baltimore. He had no family to speak of. As I mentioned, very little education. His childhood was right out of a Dickens novel. It was, and he was rough around the edges, but people could identify with him. Now think about companies or salespeople today, trying to sell a product or a service or promote their company. If your customer or prospect can identify with you or empathize with you, you just might be ahead of the game. So here's again where I say we can learn a lot from Babe Ruth. Now he also had many virtues, honesty, charity, and a complete sense of unselfishness. There was no pretense with him, none at all. So what kind of impact did he have? Well, I'll give you an example. In World War II, in the Battle of the Pacific, when Japanese troops stormed US Marines, you know what their battle cry was? To hell with Babe Ruth. It was the most insulting thing they could say to Americans. To hell with Babe Ruth. But how could a baseball player have such impact? Well, he had a brand, but it was more than that. In the fall of 2017, Norwegian Airlines put his face on the tail fins of their jets serving US routes. They call it their American Heroes program, and he was the first. Why? An executive with the airline said he inspired millions. A company that represents dead celebrities and their estates and their families, they're based in Indiana, has Babe Ruth as its single biggest client today, more than 70 years after his passing. He's far and away the #1 commodity in the billion-dollar industry of sports collecting and sports memorabilia. That's right, I said billion-dollar industry, and it is. I mentioned his old Yankees jersey, 1920, sold for $4.4 million in 2012, Guinness World Record. $4.4 million. That was almost twice what it cost to build Yankee Stadium in 1923. I mean, it's incredible. It cost $2.5 million. So how is this possible? Well, we're talking about Babe Ruth. The conference at Hofstra University, Baseball and the Sultan of Swat, which I attended. And they had Ruth's daughter, Julia. I'll mention her in a moment. She's still around. She's 102. And her son, Tom Stevens, the grandson, was there. This was a 3-day conference. And believe me, it wasn't just about baseball. They had a physicist there doing a session analyzing the dynamics of Babe Ruth's swing, right? They also had a guy named Ralph Kiner, used to be a big slugger in baseball years ago. I think he passed away not long ago. And they asked him, he was retired at this point, they said, if Babe Ruth was alive today, this was in 1995, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Ruth's birth. He was born in 1895. So they asked Ralph Kiner, 400 or 500 home runs, whatever he hit, how many home runs do you think Babe Ruth would hit if he was playing today? He thought, he said, well, about 20. So the questioner said, 20, is that all? And Kiner said, yeah, but you gotta understand, he'd be 100 years old. Babe Ruth endorsing products, and he endorsed everything. Wheaties, Babe Ruth underwear, cola. He's been on 2 US stamps. Los Angeles Dodgers. He never played for the Los Angeles Dodgers. We've got a bobblehead day. I mean, this is today they do this. I mentioned companies that use Babe Ruth to this day or very recently. It's a long list. Sony, Chevrolet, Bud Light, Boeing, Mercedes-Benz, Kia Motors, Knights of Columbus, Nestle. It goes on and on and on. All these companies with Babe Ruth, trading cards. What have we got? Donruss Company, Coors Light, Absolute Vodka, Visa, Citibank, Nike. The guy died in 1948. It's incredible. It really, he is unique. He is unique. The called shot home run I mentioned, okay. Now this is pretty cool. An ad to encourage men to have a prostate exam. Okay, he's pointing, right? I saw this last April in the Globe and Mail. Just to show you I didn't doctor up the ad, there it is. It's a full page from the Globe and Mail last April. It never says Babe Ruth, but it doesn't have to, right? And it says, his finger called the shot, next up, your prostate. This ran full page ads. I think it was in the New York Times, major newspapers all over North America, and in the fall, it ran again. I just opened it up, I'm reading the Saturday Globe one morning. What the heck? Your prostate. There